بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
So firstly, on the first issue, for those who understand the Prophet's role as being one where he is just a messenger in the sense that his understanding of the Quran was not relevant to us. Some look at the Prophet as just one who, he got the message of the Quran and he is to share that message and pass it to humanity, and that's his job. It would have been another opinion that was worth considering if his understanding of the Quran didn't matter. Part of his role was لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ, that he would explain it. So the Prophet's explanation, the Prophet's understanding, the Quran makes that as essential. He has to explain it to us. That's one side. Secondly, I think it is not easy to argue that there was no generation that understood the Quran and the responsibility of the Prophet better than the generation of the Sahaba. You know, like, here's the Prophet to whom the Quran was revealed. From his tongue he dictated what people wrote. Nobody understood the Quran better than the Prophet ﷺ. He explained the Quran to his Sahaba and how they should pray and how they should fast and all that related to the Quran. When the Prophet passed away, a big question would be, did the Sahaba or any of the Sahaba understand, therefore, we are no more interested in the comments the Prophet ﷺ had on any issue? You know, if all the Sahaba were interested in what did the Prophet say about this? What did the Prophet say about that? If it comes to how we should do our salat, okay, those details are not in the Quran. But why didn't, if the Prophet's own method was just his personal method, then we would have seen other Sahaba praying in their own way. In that you would say, well, no need to follow the Sunnah. Everything would belong to the Nafila category. There wouldn't be any fard. You know, you would not need to do Takbiratul Ihram or recite Fatiha or do this number of rakahs and all that. Why? Because it's not explicit in the Quran. The fact that all the Sahaba understood that the Prophet's position on issues mattered as part of the understanding of the message of the Quran, and the generations that came after understood that in any issue they would look at the Quran, they would look at the Sunnah. Unless when the Prophet ﷺ said, I'm leaving with you two things, the Quran and my Sunnah, why would the Quran be described as different from the Sunnah if the Sunnah was not relevant? So I feel if the Sahaba understood they should follow Quran and Sunnah, and the next generation understood they were to follow Quran and Sunnah, how can an opinion not be bid'ah, an innovation, if now it is saying we follow Quran, we don't follow Sunnah? Sunnah means you don't care about how did the Prophet who got the revelation, how did he understand it? Because if he understood it better than anybody else, then his understanding matters. And which is what we see in the Sahaba. So even if you say, let's just look at the Sahaba, did they have any doubts regarding whether the Sunnah mattered or not? None of them had any doubts about it. Then what is the usul, the basis of any doubts we or our generation would want to have regarding whether we should follow the Sunnah or not? If some are arguing, well, some of the Sunnah are not authentic, but that's not a new argument, and scholars are also concerned about authenticity, and they've come up with various criteria for authenticity. The big and most important is what is mutawatir and what is ahad. And mutawatir we've all agreed on because of their authenticity. Ahad, there's dhanni, and so other evidence come to back that up. So the whole of the field of usul is really how to manage the uncertainty that comes with evidence that is weaker than Quran and Sunnah mutawatir. But you know, I've had discussion with some of them. We have some of them in Nigeria. Some of those that one has noticed just have a lot of, you know, they say things like, oh, hadith were recorded 300, 400, 200 years after the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And you ask them, tell me about what do you know about Muwatta of Imam Malik? You know, the first books of hadith were not called hadith books. They were books of fiqh. You know, these were who was the first compiler? Umar bin Abdul Aziz asked Zuhri, Shihab Zuhri, to compile, and he compiled thousands of hadith. So hadith compilation started from the students of the Sahaba. It wasn't, Bukhari were authenticators. They had, you know, more strict criteria for accepting, but they were one of the first hadith collectors. The Hanafis and others had already started collecting hadith much earlier. So I just think it's to identify what's the particular argument a person is putting forward and to respond to these things one by one. Allahu Akbar.
Before you can.
Yes.
You know why earlier on I asked about the Jafaria and all these other people. We have a lot of people who argue, I don't know whether you heard them somewhere, who argue against Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu. You say, how can a person, one single person, have so many hadith in his memory, 10,000 or more, whatever, you know? And they say, but this is unlikely that it would happen. And then they use that kind of weak argument to that. Even that is why I said, which hadith then are they follow? Do they have their own, you know, and all that? So what would be mutawatir on their part as opposed to, you know, what the other people are saying?
The nature of mutawatir hadith is they have so many chains that if you reject one, there's always another one. Oh, I don't like Abu Hurairah. You cannot have a mutawatir hadith with only one Sahaba. So even on so many issues, between the Ja'fari, which is like the Shia and the Sunni, yes, they differ on about 20% of hadith. The difference in hadith are mainly in the chains. But because fasting and salat, all these were done publicly, even if you don't accept one chain, you will find another chain that is saying exactly the same thing. So for those who would want to reject Abu Hurairah or reject Aisha or reject this for whatever reason, those hadith that, just like Quran, those hadith that are mutawatir have so many other chains that you will find they accept the same hadith but from a different isnad. Yeah. If somebody rejects a hadith because it is Abu Hurairah, you have within hadith scholars those who will reject a hadith because Ikrimah is there, but others have no problem with it because this person. So there you'll have differences, but the fact that a hadith is narrated by only one person, like nobody else has it except this, already tells you it most likely wasn't a big issue. Okay? It wasn't a big issue. If it was a big issue, you would have heard Rai of Sahaba, you know, it can't just be one person narrating such a thing. Which is why Ahad Hadith for the early schools like Hanafi and Maliki did not put Ahad Hadith immediately after Quran, Sunnah, Mutawatir and then Ahad, because there were other sources of evidence that were just as strong or even stronger for reaching a conclusion. And the fact that they didn't use Ahad Hadith that was not supported by anything for an establishment of an Aqidah. So yes, you're a Muslim, we can disagree with that, but that's ijtihad area.
Yeah, okay. You know what I'm saying is just as a corollary to what Brother Idris was saying, because of Abu Hurairah, they want to kick all the books of Hadith out. You know, this is what he did. So yeah, I wanted you to comment on that. Maybe you have met people who are like that and all that.
Yeah, but anybody who wants to throw everything out because one, like, you have something wrong. You wouldn't do that in any other field. You know, one journalist says rubbish, all journalists are rubbish. One doctor made a mistake, all doctors. Like, nobody does that. So why do that when it comes to issues to do with deen or any other field? A mujtahid makes a mistake, so all mujtahids, like, we don't do that in any field. So I think if somebody just doesn't want to follow something, okay, then that's another argument. But if if they actually believe sincerely that they are right, and you remember our spectrum of maths and art, you know, where this one arguing is useful in reaching a conclusion, here it's not useful. You have to be very knowledgeable about art to be an art critic. You have to be very knowledgeable about music to be a music critic. You have to be very knowledgeable and have a good sense of taste to be a taster, or this or that. So I think if they are interested in moving this way, then it's to look at the particular argument. If, however, it's just I feel I prefer, not much you can do. Kalu salama, exactly. So we discussed these tools, and one of the things
the second point,
something that we found useful growing up, and if I understand what my daddy, Idris Hamisa, found interesting in the way we were learning both Quran and Hadith studies back at home. They had this MIA, meaning, implication, application. So for any hadith, any verse of the Quran that we were studying, it was important to know what does it mean, what's the implication, and how do you apply it, and how did scholars understand how it meant and how the implication and the application. So again, just a footnote to the discussion. It's useful, I think. Have I missed anything, Daddy?
No, it's fine. All is forgiven.
Thank you very much. Okay, so with all these tools we've mentioned, these are tools that the final answer is what is called a hukum shari'i at-taklifi. In other words, you're going to end up saying it is fard or wajib or mustahab or one of those categories. Hukum is the normative ruling of Sharia on an issue. Alcohol is haram from the evidence of the Quran and Sunnah. Eating pork is haram. For Malikis, eating carnivorous animals, makruh. Praying 2 rakahs before subuh, mustahab. So these are the normative judgments on things. What we will look at later, and I'm putting this just as a footnote, is when you move away from a hukum to a fatwa. Brother just before the break raised the issue of Saddu Zaria, which is a ruling on an issue making something haram, not because it is haram in and of itself, but because of what it will lead to. Generally, those 3 safety net tools, istihsan, maslaha, and saddu zaria, whenever they operate as safety nets, they produce exceptions to the rule. They don't produce new rules, they produce exceptions to the rule. And generally, the judgment they give, the judgment is temporary. Okay. Judgments from maslaha, from saddu zaria, from istihsan, by their nature are usually temporary exceptions to the rule while the exceptions last. And so, saddu zaria, blocking means to haram, that's used for all sorts of rules. Traffic rules are maslaha, or you could interpret them as saddu zaria. You know, you stop at the traffic light. The asal is ibaha, you know, the premise of things, everything is permissible except what is prohibited. Why stop me? Because of public interest. Because we want to stop you from causing harm or an accident. so you stop at the red light. Prophet didn't put any minimum age for riding a camel. Why should we have a minimum age for riding a motorcycle or owning a gun? Are you making haram what has been made halal? Maslaha is where you look at leaving it will cause more harm than restricting it. So in many societies, just like you can put a minimum age for riding a motorcycle, joining the army, holding a weapon, they put a minimum age for marriage. They put a minimum age for marriage. Why? In the interest of maslaha. Because marriage can stop education, and a lot of this education has become a fardu kifaya. But the age of marriage is mubah. You want to marry age of 10, 15, 20, 30. From the Sharia point of view, it's mubah. But if you do not prioritize education and you allow the mubah of marriage, it undermines education. In other words, a mubah undermines a fardu kifaya. The education required for a fardu kifaya is itself treated as a fardu kifaya. Because whatever is a prerequisite for a fard is treated as a fard. So there are different tools scholars have used to bring new rulings. So long as that rule serves its purpose, it stands. But it's a human rule. It's human, it's not divine. It's got precedent, it was done by the Sahaba, so we use that method. But the application in this context is from our assessment. If our society changes, and this rule is no more necessary, or we want to tweak it, we want to put a minimum age for voting to 20 instead of 18 or 6, we decide. After consultation, what's in the best interest of maslaha, what's in the best interest of community, we'll decide that. So we can challenge it. Why? It's human. Yeah, it's not like God said, Allah said, or the Prophet said. No. We are the ones who continue producing new laws for traffic, for environment, for handling pollution, for handling immigration, and all these are part of maslaha. So when people talk about Sharia, the moment you move into the secondary tools of Sharia, these are not divine laws. We use methods that are divinely sanctioned, but they have the error of human error. But we are allowed to make those mistakes. And if you make a mistake with all the best intention and you're competent, whatever the Prophet ﷺ said, you have one reward. Why? At least you tried. If you got it right, you have double reward, the Prophet ﷺ said. So just to bear in mind that any ruling that comes from the tools of ijtihad, where you know it's juristic reasoning, the moment it is not achieving a maqasid, go and revise the laws. That's actually why scholars study maqasid and qawaid, to know whether the usul needs to be changed, whether you need to revise the law. The moment you find this law is creating harm, it might have had a benefit 50 years ago or in some other society, and that's why we're doing it here. But the moment it is clearly having disadvantages that are greater than the benefit, we have to change the laws to something more appropriate. On that issue, therefore, very often the mujtahid is like your master chef. You've seen that program? They give the competitors different ingredients. And some ingredients really look crazy, They give you sugar, and they give you rice, and they give you oil, and you're scratching yourself like, what can you make with rice and oil and sugar? And a tomato, and an orange, and you're supposed to come up with something nice. How do you come up with something nice? If you're not a mujtahid, you can't come up with something nice. Yeah. But watch the master chef. That's a mujtahid at work. They use what they have. Sometimes the mujtahid is lucky. There's a verse of the Quran on the topic. Alhamdulillah. But sometimes there's no verse. There's no hadith. There's no ijma. There's no, he's all on his own. All he has is some urf and maslaha and what? Istishab, just a few things. But he's supposed to do amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. He's supposed to achieve the maqasid of Sharia with his ruling. So he does the best he can under his own circumstances, based on how he has understood the context and what is in the best interest of the maqasid of Sharia in that particular sense. Which is why ijtihad was not left for anybody. Yeah. It wasn't just anybody does it. No, you have to be knowledgeable about these tools. And today it's difficult for one person to have all the tools you require, which is why they've started having these fatwa councils where you get people who have the various tools and you thrash it out, and through that shura and consultation come up with something that is really an informed decision for the community. They'll still have difference of opinion, of course, like with any legal system. They will debate, they will argue some, but majority still feel we have to decide and we have to help. But at least you tried. Yeah. In hindsight, it was a mistake. No problem. Anybody could make mistakes, and you review and have new laws. The section 3 we will be looking at quite quickly is the issue of fiqh and Sharia, and I think we've answered this partly. Now, in one sense, you would say Sharia is divine, fiqh is human. Nobody calls any human Shari. Nobody calls any human a Shari. Only Allah is called the lawgiver. But also, nobody calls Allah faqih. Okay? Only humans do fiqh. So, from that perspective, some scholars view Sharia refers to those things that are divine injunctions and no argument, there's no human input into that. And the moment there's human input, they take this is fiqh and this is human. So that is how some draw the line. If it is Shari, it is Sharia. If it is fiqh, it is faqih. And they draw the line there. Others aren't comfortable with that line, and there's an overlap. And they take it, no, Sharia means the entire Islamic way of life. Everything. Your ibadah, your aqidah, your mu'amalat, everything is Sharia. And if it is clearly from the divine, then it is Sharia. If there's human side, it is human, not only fiqh. Because there are issues on aqidah and other areas that are also human. Some, however, prefer to look at it that Sharia is Islamic law, and they use those words interchangeably, which creates a confusion, because if you say Islamic law has sources including maslahah and whatever, but that's human reasoning. Some say yes, Sharia includes the divine part and the human part based on the sources. So, difficult to come up with just one definition that everybody will agree with. But why is the discussion important? The discussion is important because people want to draw a line between what can we argue about and what do we not argue about. And that takes us to this next thing, which is the distinction between qat'i and zanni. Qat'i means definitive, categorical, certain, no doubt. Zanni, you could say, means probable, speculative. I prefer the word presumptive. The thing is, in Arabic, just to use a spectrum, in English you can say certain and the opposite is uncertain. Okay? But this word, there is what they call waham in Arabic, which is just wishful thinking. Complete uncertainty.
Is it the same as open to probability to...
No. Waham.
Delusion.
Yeah, It could be as good as an illusion. Like there's no truth, it's just floating. As we get more certain about something, scholars try to start calling that as shak. Shak also means doubt, but now we're talking about probability. Okay, could be right, could be wrong. It's based on something, it's, you know, it has some merit. So if this is yaqeen, certainty, this would be wahab, this would be shak, this would be dhan. So when they say evidence is qat'i, this is solid evidence, no doubt about it. Dhanni is anything that has 1% doubt in it. So when they say hadith is dhanni, or this is dhanni, or qiyas is dhanni, it's not the same as it's just probability. You know, it's like it could be wrong, it could be equally wrong, or it could be equal. No, that's not how they treat it. They're treating something that is within this spectrum. And so some would say, no, Amal of Medina will be here, and Ijma or Qiyas or Ahad Hadith will be here, or they're all, it's not probable. That's why there's a you know, it's not that this is certain, this is probable, or we're talking of any degree of probability. There is a level of certainty, but not enough to speak in God's name. So two parameters, two areas of concern. One, you could have the historical authenticity or the integrity of the information or its source. When this is what they mean by thubut, or with hadith, wurud. So when they say something is qat'i thubut, it means they are certain about the authenticity. And that applies only to Quran and Sunnah, that is mutawatir. Okay. Or hadith mutawatir. The other thing is where they are looking at not the historical authenticity, the integrity, you know, when you have a prescription from your doctor, okay, when they ask, is this qat'i thubut or dhanni thubut? They're asking, how sure are we this came from the doctor? And somebody says, read it. I'm not going to read it. Let me just know where it comes from first. So that's the first concern. When you then open it to read, we are now looking at the meaning and the implication. It could mean this, it could mean that. It could mean another thing. What does Allah mean by this? Not sure. It could be this, I think it's that, but it could be that. Scholars have differed on the meaning. So then on this meaning and implication, they say it is dhanni. Where, however, the meaning is clear, no argument, they describe it as qat'i dilala. And that could apply to anything. Quran could be qat'i dilala, Quran can be dhanni dilala. Quran and Sunnah are never dhanni thubut. Yeah. On this issue, Quran and Sunnah mutawatir are always in this category on the topic of historical authenticity. But when it comes to meaning, then it could say something we are certain about. Quran would say, for example, when a woman is divorced, she should go through thalathat quru, 3 menstrual periods. Okay? Now what does that mean? Divorce takes place on this particular day. So this is when he shouts, I divorce you. So what we could do is some days pass by and her monthly periods start. And then another month goes by, another month goes by, and she has done 3 menstrual periods. Another scholar says, like in the Maliki, no. A period is the period between this time and this time. This is 2 monthly periods. It is this one that is number 3. The Quran has said something, but the scholars differ on what does it mean. Does it mean this bleeding, that counts 1 period? Or does it mean the period between this and this is 1 quru? So based on these, and I'm trying to go quickly on this, the very common problem is the dhanni dilala. Okay? So for the sake of making the permutations clear, you can have on this category thubut. It could be qat'i, thubut, or you can have zanni, thubut. On this line, you have dilala, which means the implication of the meaning. In other words, what does it mean? Here you're talking about the authenticity, and here you could have qat'i dilala and you could have dhanni dilala. Of course, as we've already said, qat'i thubut is only Quran and Hadith or Sunnah that is mutawatir. So when it comes to a combination, you can have teachings of the Quran, Islamic teachings that are qat'i thubut and qat'i dilala. We are certain about the authenticity and we are certain about what it means. That there's only one God. Difference of opinion? No difference of opinion. You know, does a hereafter exist? No difference of opinion. It comes from qat'i thubut and it comes from qat'i dilala. Then you have some things that are dhanni thubut, like single chain hadith or qiyas or any of those things, but qat'i dilala. So you have a hadith that is single chain hadith, but the meaning is very clear what it means. Like a hadith prohibiting eating of carnivorous animals, for example. It's qat'i dilala. But because it is dhanni dilala, it doesn't have as much weight as other tools, for example, depending on the school. Then you can have qat'i thubut, but dhanni dilala, as we just gave the example. The Quran says something, but the mufassirun differ on what does it mean. And then the big area is dhanni thubut and dhanni dilala. There's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, a nation that is led by a woman will not succeed. It's a single chain hadith, dhanni thubut, and the scholars differ on the meaning. Is it to be understood in the context of the surrounding hadith in Bukhari about the fulfillment, like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani when commenting on this hadith says some scholars understood this hadith to be talking about the fulfillment of the Ghulabatu Rum, the conquest of the Romans, and the Romans were going to conquer the Persians. And when the news came, because the Prophet had done a dua, may Allah tear the kingdom of Persia, the way they tore the letter that was sent to them, they killed the messenger that was sent and all of that. And when politics, you know, it was getting to like 9th year, everybody was expecting something is going to happen in Persia in fulfillment of that prophecy. the king's political advisor was actually his vizier. Okay, he's like minister of affairs, his assistant in that sense. When the king died, instead of getting the vizier, who was the political administrative brain behind the place, they instead gave the kingdom to the daughter. And the vizier left the kingdom. And when the news came to the Prophet ﷺ that this had happened in Persia, he said in one of the narrations of the hadith that the kingdom that is led by the queen would not succeed. In other versions, the nation that is led by a woman, like every nation or this nation. The fact that Aisha headed a battle of over 20,000 men, including Talha and Zubair, the fact that the Quran praises Bilqis for her leadership qualities made some feel this hadith is not general, but specific to the fulfillment of a prophecy. Because some thought it meant this other, no, it means that, etc. But it is dhanni dilala. They differ on the dilala. What does it mean? They differ on the thubut because it is single chain hadith, not mutawatir. This is double reason to calm down. This is double reason. There's so many issues belonging to this. When you see the tension, all arguments on music belong to this category. Yeah, any topic that you find, this argument seems never to be resolved. Go and start sieving the evidence one by one and see why.
That's exactly why people are Quranists.
Sorry?
That's why people are Quranists only.
Well, for some, yes. But because we have mutawatir, that is qati thubut. You know, we have sunnah that are thubut, which are those sunnah that we don't disagree on. And even, you know, it's not a, there's a gradient here. Maybe one should touch on this actually. You can have a single chain hadith, but it becomes weaker when it contradicts the practice of Sahaba. It becomes weaker when it contradicts maslahah. It becomes weaker when it contradicts other tools, qiyas and other things. However, it becomes stronger when it is supported by the ra'i of Sahaba. It becomes stronger when it is supported by Amal Madinah. It becomes stronger. In other words, it's not a simple straight line. Every case you will have to look at, you know, when a scholar says this is halal or haram or whatever, you look at the kind of evidence they build up for it or against it. In other words, see how deep the rooting on the usul goes. Like, is it holding on to an ayah of the Quran, a hadith, one root, two roots, three roots, you know, like what is it holding on to? Then you know the length. You know the strength, sorry, of the opinion. Unfortunately, many of our people, they just know the fruit of the tree. How weak or strong is the root? No, they just argue and inshallah. So, we don't have time to go much deeper onto this issue of the certainty, but one thing I'd like to say is any verse or hadith that you pick, just one, just pick one, it's considered dhanni. Okay, the default on any individual verse or any individual hadith is it is dhanni. It becomes thubut as you look at other verses and other verses, and then the meaning starts to get more certain. You pick a hadith that says something, even if it sounds as if it's giving an instruction, you know, after Yawm al-Jum'ah, fantashiru fil ard. Like it's an instruction. Instruction meaning it is permissible. Imam Ash-Shawkani says the sigat al-amr, the imperative form of an instruction in Arabic could handle up to 15 different meanings. You know, when I say drink your tea, because if you don't drink, I'll punish you, or drink your tea, otherwise I'll not give you another cup. You know, like, it's when you look at all evidence that you begin to know whether there's a punishment related to this, whether it is fard or wajib or mustahab. It's all an instruction. And so when you hear an instruction, the Quran says when you take a loan, whether the amount is large or small, faktubuhu, write it down. You mean you want 2 ringgit, and what do you call it here? Rands? You want 2 rands to buy something, I'll give you the money tomorrow. We have to write it down. You know, the Prophet didn't write down all transactions. He, number of, small amount, your word is enough. Because of that, you found the Maliki and the Hanbali and some of these other scholars saying it is, even though it says faktubu, write it down, it is only mustahab. It's encouraging you to write it down, not it's an obligation, and if you don't, there's a sin. And so when there's an instruction, some scholars start with the istishab. Everything is permissible. You can write it, you can, in other words, ibaha means like freedom. Okay? No restriction except if there's evidence. So when there's an instruction, they would say, the first assumption is, since we know everything is halal except what is haram, but this seems to be evidence countering that, then this one can only be makruh, not haram. More evidence will raise it to the level where, now we can say comfortably it is haram. Other scholars start from the assumption that al-amr, when there's an injunction or there's a nahi, there's a prohibition, they start with the assumption that it is meaning it is haram, or an amr is wajib. But that's just the starting point. Starting point meaning they will not conclude on one single ayah or hadith that it is fard or wajib, and that's the judgment. Because they all know they have to look at all the other evidence. Yeah. It's just that it's the starting point that differs. Some say we start with the assumption that it is makruh, and we will get evidence to gradually say it stays as makruh or it goes to haram. Others will say we start with the position that it is haram, and as we go around the evidence we will find out whether it's makruh or whether it stays there. So it's just the starting point that differs. The final position will only be reached after assessment of all the evidence. So any individual evidence is dhanni, unless you have gone through the surrounding evidence, then you can now, dhanni becomes a qati. You know, dhanni dilala, what does it mean? It means this, but since you know you're taking a verse out of context, since you will interpret it within the context of the whole Quran, then you only conclude on what it definitely means. You only say it is qati when you have seen all the necessary evidence. That's why when somebody says this is haram, based on what? Oh, this verse. That's all? Nobody seems to understand that except you. You know, it's difficult to just have one piece of evidence making a thing haram with no supporting evidence. Okay, it's really difficult. There were so many Sahaba, so many. How can you say we only have one piece of evidence, nothing else to support it? The last part we will be looking at regarding this is to another attempt by scholars to get to greater certainty. So we've spoken of this dhani thubut, dhani dilala, on the meaning and authenticity, but this applies to something the gentleman was raising earlier. Did the Prophet speak in his capacity as a leader or in his capacity as a prophet? The Prophet ﷺ was a prophet, a messenger to humanity. He was also head of state and the political leader. He was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He was a mentor to the Sahaba and his families. He was a judge. He was a mufti. He was all of these. Now, some scholars restricted the Prophet's role to just about 3 distinct roles. Others said no, they are up to 4 or 5. Others went to 7. Ibn Ashur, which is what we put there, mentioned 12 different capacities in which the Prophet said and did things. Why is this important? The number of categories is not as important as the existence of categories. So whether you say there are 8 or it doesn't matter. The key thing is it's not one. That's what really matters. And the reason why these categorizations are important, and actually let me put it there, why do you think those categories are important? Why do you think scholars wanted to go into whether this was said in his capacity as a prophet, or as a judge, or as a political leader, or just an Arab doing things in his own context? Yes?
I think because of the varied situations that he found himself in. Sometimes he had to act as a leader, sometimes he had to act as a commander, sometimes as a preacher, as a da'i. So the situation would make him perform different actions at different times, different titles.
Okay, so in summary, that he responded to different situations and contexts, and that would help decide which one he was operating as. Good?
He wasn't unidimensional, and he responded to man's comprehensive way of life. No matter where you find yourself, he is an example for you to emulate.
Good. So
would you say that he was not speaking out of his desires, the Quran says? So
no.
Every situation would be then divinely inspired.
No, that is dhanni dilala. That is the meaning some take from the verse of the Quran, that the Prophet doesn't speak on his own desire, and they say yes regarding the Quran. But there were times the Prophet would say something and the Quran will correct the Prophet ﷺ. There are things he would say he would regret. There are things he would do and he would be corrected. There are ideas he would give regarding the arrangement in the battlefield, and somebody actually asked him, you know, is this arrangement for the Battle of Badr, why? Or is it your own harb wal makid, your own idea of military strategy, whatever? He said it is not why, but it is my own ra'i of what would be military strategy. So the gentleman who had more experience in warfare said, if that is the case, can I suggest something else? We have debates among the Sahaba and the Prophet regarding where to fight the Battle of Badr. Sorry, Uhud. Okay? The Prophet, Abu Bakr, and some of the older ones wanted the Battle of Badr to be fought in the city, as they did with Khandaq. The younger ones said, no, let's go outside. But they were the majority. Okay? And after the Shawirhum fil consulting, and the majority wanted to go out, said, no problem. If the Sahaba understood this was the Prophet talking as a messenger of God, nobody would challenge him on that. Yeah. So they didn't understand everything the Prophet said as everything is wahi. No, they understood the Quran is wahi, the Hadith Qudsi is wahi, but in his own wording, but not everything he said, everything he did. And that is why the Prophet even said, and warned people who were presenting evidence that you may give me evidence, but because of how you present it, I am convinced that you are right, but you are wrong. And he warned them, Allah will punish you for that. You know, if it was all wahi, there's no need to ask of how you present. Sorry.
So do you think that's what's missing in our critical analysis of our hadith? So we authenticate the isnad, authenticate the matan, and we forget the context. Or we don't look deeply enough into the context. He might have been jesting in humor with someone, and that's recorded, but the context is not recorded. And so what might have been humor or descriptive becomes prescriptive.
Yes, that sometimes happens, and there you would usually find the difference of opinions of scholars coming up, where some looked at it this way, another looked at it that way. So for example, when it came to, and if you don't, just give me a few minutes, I'll just cover a little and then we'll come. I see many hands wanting to go up. So we gave example of Battle of Badr. But with all these different roles the Prophet played, scholars generally divided them into two. Tashri' and Ghayra Tashri'. What was legislative and what was not legislative and actually responds to context, and as context changed, we appreciate that judgment in its context, for example. And what are those things that are tashri? Prayers, you see me pray, and we are going to prayers, we see the Prophet pray. And we saw all the Sahaba doing the same. In other words, they didn't understand this was some personal thing. No, this was part of how he wanted all of us to behave. Take your Hajj rights from me. How are we going to perform Hajj and go from where to where, etc. Those generally are things that relate to ibadah, but there are some in the areas of mu'amalat where these were from the Prophet to us as a messenger of Allah to everybody. There are those things the Prophet ﷺ said or did as a political leader. So who is appointed as a governor? This is for him as a political leader. Who is to, what should be the tax for this? Who should we fight with? Who should we have treaties with? You don't say appointing governors is the sunnah. Any of us can appoint a governor. Or we're going to go into treaty with this, we're going to declare war with that. No, you have to be the political leader for that responsibility. The Prophet played some roles in the capacity as a judge. You don't say the punishment for stealing is cutting the hand. It's there in the Quran, it's there in the Sunnah. Therefore, to be a good Muslim, I will also cut the hand. Like no school, no madhab, nobody does that type of thing. Why? It is a sunnah for those who are judges. So in your capacity, in the Prophet's capacity as a judge, yes, he can order this punishment and that punishment. You don't say, I'm following Quran and Sunnah and I will also do that. So it's not as simple as, I found a hadith in Bukhari and let's act on it. Yeah. This is why some of the scholars would go extra mile. If you're not qualified anywhere around this ijtihad, just follow your madhab. Don't stop even, because some people, you jump usul, you don't know how the rulings were derived. Now you go into the Quran, oh, this verse says, whatever. Whoever judges by any other than Allah, فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. Based on that, all sorts of people became kuffar. Nobody understood that from the Quran, no scholar understood that. They would have nuances. Alcohol is haram. If you find somebody drinking, you say, why are you drinking? Don't you know alcohol is haram? Yes. Why are you drinking? Oh, because the Quran is wrong. Oh, that is clear contradiction. They'll say, there's not ignorance. They will say that is kufr. Another person, why are you drinking? You know it's haram. Yes, I know it's haram. But you're still drinking. It gets cold and peer pressure and just a sip, like. You agree it's haram? Yes. That is fisk, that is wrongdoing. You're not a kafir. Why? You have accepted the hukum of Allah that it is haram. You're just weak in the implementation. Another person, you're drinking, yes. But alcohol is haram. No, it's not. It says so in the Quran. No. You are making a mistake in the implementation. It says, فَاجْتَنِبُوهُ, keep away from it. Like for most of the time, don't stay with it. But if it's a little, and it doesn't, and he starts going into all this ta'wil, whatever, he is not called a kafir, because his intention is not to go against Allah. You call that bid'ah. It is called bid'ah because this is a new teaching presented as an Islamic teaching but not rooted in the Quran or the Sunnah. It's gone contrary but is being presented as a counterfeit. Okay, we'll come back to bid'ah soon. So just wrongdoing was not all in the same box of kufr. This is hukum bi ghayrillah, therefore blah blah blah. And the same thing with Sunnah, keeping the beard. For many of the Shafis, keeping the beard was a good urf, just like female circumcision was considered a good urf, so they considered it mustahab, not fard or wajib. Other scholars differed. Usually, if they see that in Jahiliyyah, leaders kept a beard, and in that urf, it was the honorable thing to do, because al-ada muhakkama, because good custom is a source of law, and the Prophet does it, they take it's because it's a good urf. So they would encourage it. But they wouldn't rank it to the level of fard. But it's because some scholars look at that as the Prophet speaking as an Arab and recommending something good in his context, whereas others view, no, that was the Prophet speaking as a prophet, and they look at it as it is mustahab, or sorry, it is wajib for everybody to keep a beard. In other words, you do have some hadith where scholars differ on, is the Prophet speaking as a messenger on this one, or is he speaking in a different capacity? And where they differ in which capacity, they differ in the rulings. So when in Maliki school, for example, there's a case of a lady who wanted a divorce. What was his name? Bin Qais, Thabit. She wanted a divorce from her husband. Prophet said, did he do anything wrong? No, nothing wrong. I just don't love him. There are different versions of the hadith. One, he was coming with his friends, he looked like the ugliest of all of them. He was too short. Different versions. Allahu Adam. But you had different states. But she made it clear he hasn't done anything wrong. Okay? She's just lost her love. She's no more interested in him. Prophet asked her, are you ready to give back the garden that he gave you as mahar, the gift for marriage? She said, I'm ready to give him double. I'm ready to multiply. I just want to get out of this. He said, no need. So he goes to Thabit and tells him, this is what your wife wants, and I suggest you, let her go. No problem. From the Maliki point of view, that was the Prophet ﷺ, that when he told Thabit, accept it, it meant she has a right to it. Okay? She has a right to it. So in Maliki fiqh, khulu, this divorce initiated by the wife, is the full right of the wife. Yeah, she doesn't need a good reason. She's lost love, she can get a khulu. Of course, most judges will not be keen to support divorce and all of that. Like, come on man, give a good reason, especially if there are children and this and that, etc. Just as we would discourage any form of divorce. But if the person insists, and at the time of at the time of Umar and at the time of Uthman, you had cases of husbands coming saying they are not agreeing to the wife being divorced, but the caliph gave a divorce. So for some, the Prophet was speaking in his capacity as a judge. As a judge. As a judge, when he says you should divorce her, there's no choice there. Others look, like in the Hanafi, they look at the Prophet in that Thabit case as acting in his capacity as an advisor. So he was advising Thabit, you should divorce her. Hypothetically, if Thabit said, no way, I'm not, then what? Then they would just still be married. Okay? So, because some look at the Prophet in his capacity just as giving advice, the ruling there is that the husband still has to agree to the khulu, okay, to the divorce that was initiated by the wife. Whereas in Malik, the husband doesn't have to agree. If the judge has heard it, he acts in his capacity as a judge, and it's gone. So you do have some differences of opinion based on whether the scholars saw this in his capacity as this or another capacity. There was a lady, Barira. She wanted a divorce from her husband. And the husband loved his wife. Did everything he could. Please, please, don't divorce, don't divorce. The husband went to the Prophet ﷺ and asked the Prophet ﷺ, please intercede, speak to her. So he goes and speaks to her. And after the long discussion and all he could say to her, she asked the Prophet, are you speaking to me in your capacity as the Prophet that I should go? Or is this your personal advice on behalf of her former husband, her husband actually? He said, no, it's not in my capacity as a Prophet, just advice. She said, I'm sorry, I can't take it. And the marriage broke. Okay. So key point is, when the Prophet said something, in what capacity did he speak? And when scholars differ, you find the rulings differ. It's not that they don't know the hadith. Be very careful about this. It's not that they don't know the hadith. No. It's what category did they put the hadith. So it's not is it sahih or not. Yeah. This is very simplistic. You have to go, oh, but there's one hadith, it's in Bukhari, and that's not the issue. Yeah. So, you can have time to go through the prophetic intent, the various Prophet ﷺ in his capacity as mufti, and we gave the example of kissing wife, yes, and where it's responding to case by case. There's where it is in his capacity as a messenger for all mankind. Those things where he did in his capacity as head of state, and instructions he gave his wives that he didn't give others. He prohibited his women from using gold. Okay? He prohibited them from using gold. He didn't prohibit other women from using gold. He didn't want members of the household of the head of state to live a very luxurious or flamboyant lifestyle. And so even his daughter, Fatima, when she wanted house help, he discouraged her. There was no problem, Abu Bakr and others, whatever. When he would sleep himself, he would sleep on a mat, And Umar asked, Umar saw the lines of the markings, like, Ya Rasul, but that, he didn't say all Sahaba, you should also use mats, you should also use this, etc. There was that principle of ibadah, of everything is permissible except what is prohibited. So the need to really just be very careful when we are approaching Sunnah and what is its context before you start making judgments. Otherwise, we create a lot of harm. You remove the flexibility of the Sunnah by adding cultural things. So instead of Islam being able to move within African and Chinese and Indian and European and everywhere, you go and add all this excess baggage. You know how it is on getting on a plane? You've got all this excess baggage and nobody wants you. You can see from the look, they will find you. You slow yourself down, you slow Islam down. Islam would have moved with full speed if you didn't tie all this baggage to it in the name of, oh, it's Sunnah, oh, it's Sunnah. To really look very carefully, especially where you are dealing with people from diverse customs and cultures.